Muy buenos días nuevamente. Reconvenimos entonces.
Good morning again. We will resume our activities, and I apologize.
¿Sí?
You were going to say something.
Ahora un momento. Muy buenos días.
Yes.
Muy
Good
buenos
morning.
días. Soy la doctora Mara Gómez
I
y
am
tengo el
Dr.
gusto
Mara
de
Gomez,
darles la
and I am
bienvenida
happy
al
to
panel
welcome you
magistral
back
Nuevas
to
tendencias para
the
asegurar
keynote panel, New
equidad en la
Trends
contienda
to
electoral
ensure
en Iberoamérica.
equity
Me
in
permito presentarles
elections in
a los miembros del
Ibero-America. I would
panel.
like to introduce the
En
panel
primer lugar,
members.
a María de
First of
Lourdes
all,
González
María de
Prieto,
Lourdes González
directora del
Prieto,
programa en
Director
Paraguay
of
de
the
IDEA Internacional.
program in Paraguay for International IDEA.
A Rafael Rubio,
Rafael Rubio,
subdirector de Estudios
Deputy
e
Director for
Investigación del
Studies and
Centro de
Research
Estudios
in the
Políticos y
Center of Political and
Constitucionales de España.
Constitutional Studies of Spain.
A José Luis Vargas Valdés,
José Luis
magistrado de la
Vargas
Sala
Valdés,
Superior del Tribunal
Magistrate
Electoral del
of
Poder
the
Judicial de la
High Chamber
Federación
of the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary,
y preside este panel Daniel
and
Sobato,
Daniel
director
Sobato,
regional para
Regional
América
Director for
Latina
Latin
y el
America
Caribe
and
de
the
IDEA
Caribbean for
Internacional.
International
Y ahora sí,
IDEA, will be
cedo-
chairing this panel.
Cedo la palabra
So
al
now I will
presidente
give the
del
floor
panel, Daniel
to
Sobato.
the
Adelante,
chairman
doctor,
of the
por favor.
panel,
Perdón,
Mr.
Mara,
Daniel
por este
Sobato.
intento
Go
de
ahead.
golpe de estado fallido.
I'm sorry, Mara, because of my failed coup.
No había estado alerta de que
I wasn't
teníamos esta
aware
metodología,
that we were
así que
going to
mis
have
más
this
sinceras
methodology,
disculpas.
so
Trataré
I
la
sincerely
próxima vez de ser
apologize.
efectivo en el
Next
golpe de
time,
Estado
I will
y
try to be
consolidarlo.
effective in my coup d'etat.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Queridas amigos y amigos, estamos un poquito
Dear
tarde.
friends, we are a little
casi
bit
25
behind
minutos,
schedule, almost 25
y
minutes.
Entonces queremos tratar de hacer un
So
esfuerzo
I
para ir
want to
recuperando
try and
los tiempos de manera tal de que el programa
recover
no se nos desajuste
so
demasiado.
we don't lag behind by
tomar
too
en
much.
cuenta
We must take into
también,
account
que
also
los amigos,
that
mexicanos nos
our
están haciendo
friends
un
from
favor,
Mexico
porque
are
no
doing us
vamos
a
a comer
favor
a las 4
because
de la
we're
tarde,
not going to
sino a las
have
2 de la
lunch at
tarde,
4
lo cual-
p.m. like they usually
lo
do,
cual
but
se
at
les
2 p.m.
agradece de manera
And
muy
we
especial.
thank them for that.
En eventos anteriores
In previous
comenzaban a
events,
desmayarse la gente a
people
alrededor
would
de las
start
3,
would
3 y
start
media de la
fainting
tarde.
about 3:30
Así que,
p.m.
es un-
So
tenemos que también cumplir con el tema
we
para
have
la
to
comida.
also abide by the
En aras
schedule
de
for
hacer esta reducción de
for
tiempo,
lunch.
yo
Now, in order
no
to
voy a
do
hacer
this,
mis
I
palabras de
won't
introducción al panel,
give
y
my
le voy a explicar
introduction
rápidamente
speech,
la
and I will
metodología
just
que
explain
proponemos.
very quickly the methodology that we are
Lo que
proposing
queremos es
for this panel.
motivar
What we want to do
diálogo
here
y
is to
participación,
motivate and
y no
to
hacer
encourage
conferencias
dialogue and
largas.
participation, and not just have
Entonces,
like
la
long
metodología es la
speeches. So
siguiente.
the methodology will be
Para
as
un tópico de
follows.
la gran importancia como tiene el
For
tema de la equidad en la
a
contienda
topic, a
electoral,
subject
y
as
tratando de
important
identificar
as
cuáles son las
equity in
nuevas
elections, and
tendencias en
try
materia de
to try
equidad,
to understand the new
cada uno de
trends
nuestros
in
tres
equity.
ponentes en este orden, primero va a hablar
Well, first
Rafael,
we will have
en
Rafael,
segundo lugar
then
va
we
a
will
hablar,
have
José Luis, en
José
tercer lugar
Luis,
va a hablar
and
Lourdes.
then
Van a hacer
Lourdes.
una
They
intervención
will
inicial de no más de 7 minutos para
talk
poner
for
el tema
about
sobre la
7
mesa
minutes
desde sus
just
propias
to
perspectivas.
just like a brief introduction
Agotadas estas
from
tres
their
intervenciones
standpoint.
en este
After
orden,
these
el
3
moderador,
interventions
mi
happen,
persona, va a
the
hacerle
moderator,
una
which is
pregunta
me,
a cada uno de-
I will
a
ask
cada uno de
one
ellos
question
para
to each one
profundizar
of
en
them
uno de los
in order
aspectos de su
to
intervención,
delve a little
cuya
bit
respuestas
deeper
no tienen que ir más allá de
in
3
some of the
minutos,
aspects, and
y luego
the,
abrimos para
the
tener un
answer
diálogo
mustn't be
entre
longer than
todos de
3
manera
minutes
tal
long,
de que
so
sea
we
lo
can
más
then open up the floor
participativo
for a dialogue,
y
so we can
esté
have
basado
a very
en un verdadero
hands-on
proceso de diálogo.
forum
Así que, sin más, doy
and
el
based
uso
on
de la
dialogue.
palabra a
So,
Rafael
without further
por
ado, I would
7
like to give the floor to Rafael for 7 minutes.
Ahora. Muchísimas gracias, Daniel. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much,
por la
Daniel.
invitación.
Thank you for
eh,
inviting me
y
to
también
attend
quería empezar
this
pidiendo
conference.
perdón, ¿no?
And
Pidiendo
first, I
perdón
would like to
porque que un español
apologize
venga a
because
este
a Spaniard
congreso a
coming
hablar
here
del
to this
concepto
Congress
del
to
principio de
talk
equidad,
about
que es
equity,
un principio que en el fondo
which is a
se ha
principle
elaborado
that
fundamentalmente en Latinoamérica,
has been very present in Latin America. It reminded me of those the Japanese people that go to Spain and try to be flamenco teachers. So you know more about this topic than me probably, but since I am part of the keynote panel and I just have 7 minutes, then things get very exciting. And I just got 3 hours ago to the airport in Mexico City, so it has all been very, very fast. And I've only fallen asleep once in the speech, so I'm sure this won't be a second one. Well, to talk about electoral equity, well, why was I invited? I really don't know, but maybe because I've been been for 15 years and on the other side. I've been doing electoral campaigns in different countries in the world for different political parties, and I think that there is an element of electoral equity that is very practical. The issue of applying this principle has to do with how do you develop the elections, because in the concept I think we all agree or kind of agree, and there are not large elements that separate us. But today or this week, The Economist surprised us with a cover that was asking us if social media is ruining democracy, and in an internal reflection I thought it was a bit exaggerated. But I wanted to talk about two main things that, in my opinion, change in a radical way the way we understand the electoral campaigns, and mention, because in 7 minutes I don't have a lot of time, to just mention a series of specific problems. My general stance might be not everyone might agree with it, but this environment has changed so much that we have to change some regulations, and this has an impact on equity. And just to name a few examples, when we check, well, in Spain, there are more statements regarding the use of networks and social media, but the body that wants to that regulates this, it started in 2007, where there was no Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and in one way or another, this happens in most countries. There is a deep issue that has to do with how much can we regulate this, and what can be the nature of this regulation. Because a specific regulation can never encompass a problem that changes without exaggerating. It changes every month. Every month we have new tools, new ways, or new things that can be applied in campaigns. This is why this book that has been given to us by IDEA states that electoral legislation tends to expand itself. Now, but I like actually the opposite, just establishing basic principles and applying them. But to apply these principles, these basic principles, we need a technical knowledge. And in some electoral tribunals, I think we are a bit scarce in that topic, just to put it that way. So I wanted to say two comments now. One has to do with time, and the other one with space. It can seem very generic, but I think it determines the new nature of electoral campaigns. Time. Manuel Castells was saying that time in internet is some kind of eternal, immediate. It happens at all times, and it is indefinite, it is infinite online, and this has an impact on electoral campaigns. Things are happening faster and faster, and it's harder to have an answer that can really have effects and can really guarantee or protect electoral equity. Along these lines, we are facing times that have an impact on the delimitation of campaigns, that also have a prohibition of surveys because of time constraints. Also, social media have their own campaigns that sometimes is even more effective than the physical one. And now, space. Space is important because we have a mindset where the internet is a second-tier reality, and this was a reality at least until the last presidential election in the US. But now we see that the internet is more real than reality itself sometimes, because the electoral decision is based on perceptions. The voters make a decision based on their perception, not based on reality. And today, working online is changing the perceptions in a way that is quicker, more efficient, and especially especially when voting, is more effective than many other media where we were focused before. And The Economist, like I was saying before, was saying that 150 million Americans saw in their Facebook pages information which is more than the Americans that voted in the election, 150 million. So we're facing a paradox because we see things that are, let's say, like having advertisement of a political party in the shorts of a boxer, a box fighter, and we think of the internet as a second-tier thing. And in Mexico we have some examples. For instance, in, I think it was 2011, we understood, or you understood, that what could be done in YouTube wasn't relevant because the user would have to go look for it, which wasn't entirely true. So there are certain elements that with this framework can help us to think about this and to ponder it, and that have an impact on electoral equity. One has to do with funding. I think that micro funding for elections is a reality, and it's a reality that doesn't have an answer. If it's before or after, I mean, if it's an exclusive funding method, I think it presents problems. Today, in the picture, I was thinking about it. There was one official picture and 17 unofficial pictures. And the electoral campaigns, the same thing happens. There's one official picture and there's 17 unofficial campaigns that are more efficient in swaying voters than the official campaign, which is the one we usually focus on. When we talk about third parties, we talk about real or fictitious third parties. We have bots, more than 33,000 in the American campaign, and just in Twitter we talk about people from other nationalities that participate actively in campaigns, that we have been talking about, well, the media has been talking a lot about the Russian influence in the American elections, and they are not regulated because they are not members of the parties, and they are not candidates, and they are not part of the media that today have a very relevant role in the electoral campaign. And I really want to focus now on something that, I mean, when people talk about equity, they usually don't mention this, because equity means that we have similar or the same conditions for the elections, but it also looks to protect the citizens. And sometimes we forget that citizen protection. And there are some elements that I don't have time to mention right now, but that have to do with respect to the voter. Also, The Economist was saying that 77,000 different advertisements were published that were adapted to groups of that were very small, that less than 10 people. So everyone knew what they wanted and when they wanted it. So things that have to do with respecting the voters, this, I mean, I don't have time to talk about those things, so thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much, Rafael. I think that the emphasis, and I would like us to go a little bit deeper on that, the disruptive effect of the technologies compared to how things were done even 10 years ago. But it looks, 10 years ago, it seems like it was a longer time ago. So the impact of these last 10 years and how the regulatory frameworks, in the face of this new technology, new and fast-evolving technology, it presents issues to regulate it and to control it. José Luis, please go ahead. First of all, and please let's not start counting my 7 minutes yet, I would like to thank you all for being here today in this first panel, and I would particularly like to thank Daniel Sobato, Dr. Daniel Sobato, for all his work, his hard work, and his participation, where he has involved all of you actively, and it has involved the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary as strategic partner. And I would also like to thank the Chief Magistrate for all your support. and I'm sure this event will be very enriching regarding our conclusions for a very important topic. And now we can start with my 7 minutes, please. If you continue saying good things about me, you can continue on talking forever. And all these things that present challenges and dilemmas when it comes to democracy, and of course one of them, which is the one we are talking about today, which is equity, is a concept from my standpoint and a mechanism that has to do or can be used to reduce the gap between political parties, institutions, and citizens. We were talking about the indices of the Latino Barometro and other ones, of how worldwide people are disenchanted with democracy, and this is growing. And this not only has to do, or this not only happens in developing countries or developed countries. It has to do with a human aspect internationally, globally. And I think in that point, that disenchantment, we have to ask ourselves the causes. What are the causes? And from my standpoint, there are many causes, and we need to understand our co-responsibility regarding this disenchantment. In the case of the judges, which is my perspective, I think that link, that we are that link. And talking about equity, it not only has to do with, like Rafa Rubio was saying, with funding or with the media, but also in the case of judges, the disenchantment is linked to a perception of justice. And I'm saying this because I think that judges, even more so than anyone else, we are the first ones that have to look after equity and keep and maintain equity in elections, as just to lay out the rules of the game, so we can have a democratic elections where everyone is included and everyone has everyone can participate in an egalitarian way. And I think that principle has to be translated in something that's paramount, and above all, it has to be translated in administration process balance. So all of them that have to do, or that are related, or in this topic, have to take part in this. And I think that's the first perception that has to be taken into account by all of us, that the possibility that before any kind of controversy or dispute or any kind of breach to the rights, it can be checked by an impartial authority. And I think this is where the fairness principle applies, which is this plan where it's just some kind of feeling from the parties that participate in democracy. They want to feel that there was a balance and there was there was fairness. And this concept of fairness, it takes us judges it leads us to something that goes beyond formalities, which, because we are dealing with the perception whether the political party was fair and the arbitrator applied the rules of the game in a fair manner. And we as judges sometimes have a problem when addressing this, because we judges are not very popular. A ruler can have 70 or 80% popularity rate, but we cannot have more than 50%, because there's always one part that loses and one part that wins. So our highest standard is 50% of popularity or acceptance or approval rating. But now if we have to see that if the person who, let's say, won our ruling, if they completely agree with what we said, because whether we and that perception of a fair treatment that is based on the our decisions being congruent, and that is in time based on legitimacy. That is the only sound defense that we as judges can have in the face of inconformity or disenchantment, that our decisions are not decisions that change in time. So in order to do this, I think that the main point is that our rulings and our sentences are based on the precedents, but also that they are based on the concrete case, so that when things change, we can have that capability of explaining what the new circumstances are, what the new reality is that is modifying our interpretation as judges. Some things that I think have to do with this congruence and this perception of legitimacy of the judicial branch, of course, has to do with the good practices, and this implies to improve and strengthen legitimacy and equity when it comes to justice, and also to encourage equity. And this is just what I call having an even floor. This is to deal with due processing, so that the parties cannot say that they weren't, that we didn't listen to them, to each one of their arguments that would help us protect justice. And of course, a very important task, in my opinion, has to do with including minorities in the face of the institutional apparatus of the political parties and institutions. The democratic and electoral judges have to understand that a very important part of our duties is protecting the political and electoral rights of everyone. And I'm about to wrap up. Just to wrap up, I would like to say that these challenges, these democratic challenges, which can be new technologies and so on, they will continue to arise every day. We will face them every day. And they are things that we didn't foresee, that we didn't forecast, and we need to adapt ourselves and adapt them to reality and adapt them to the pre-existing rules. But I think that all of this has to happen in a framework of independence and impartiality that is objective and is identifiable by the people. So the way judges act has to have an impact on our behavior. Judges that are if people have the perception that judges are biased, then that is a big issue. But there's also something else that has to be in our minds, that anything that has to do with threats, with blackmail to the judges, of course, that damages that balance between of independence and unbiased conditions. And since we have concerns that have to do with our well-being and the well-being of our families. So there are external parties that also have an impact on this. And I would like to wrap up by echoing what the Chief Magistrate was saying during her intervention. I think that the main factor that allows for this perception of balance to happen, of judges that are unbiased and impartial, has to do a task of everyone, but specifically a task of the judges, because we are judges that are committed to enforcing the Constitution. And Hans Kelsen, I think, mentioned this, where clearly Hans Kelsen was right by saying that constitutional tribunals are tribunals that are abiding by the law and have to enforce the Constitution in the legal framework that corresponds to that is something of a political and contentious or litigious character, and I think that we have to abide by that position, that we need to enforce the Constitution, and that has to be done in accordance with the law and not just based on politics or other matters that are alien on of this enforcement. So that would be it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jose Luis, for your speech and your the excellent structure of your words, and you focused on the judges to guarantee the equity and that fairness, like you were saying, that is so important, to guarantee that even playing field, and so that citizens can really perceive that judges are guaranteeing this and achieving this. Lourdes, you have 7 minutes, please. Thank you. It is an honor for me to be in this meeting, and it is an honor to represent International IDEA. And I would like to tell you that what I'm about to share with you is not just it's not something I created myself, but it's a teamwork, team effort, and most of them are very young and very talented women, and I would like to highlight that because of what I'm going to talk about. Well, the legitimacy of a democracy, as we already know, depends on the elections being free, authentic, and transparent. The efficient and effective performance of the administration and electoral justice are essential to guarantee the integrity of the elections. Also, the absence of electoral system that allows us to mitigate the inequality can give rise to disenchantment. And beyond the rights that are in paper for an election to be considered a proper one, it depends on, or it relies on, the electoral judges to provide fair treatment to all the population. This Ibero-American conference, it's the 9th edition. It presents us with a unique opportunity to renew the commitment of the bodies of electoral justice in the region to mitigate inequality in elections. And even though the Ibero-American Conference are focused on the competence of the electoral justice, they contribute to highlighting the elements that can be the basis for a discussion to reformulate some things that can contribute to democracy. Equity in the electoral and political framework implies that the authorities and the other competent stakeholders can be able to guarantee conditions so that all people, men and women, participate in conditions of equality, regardless of their ethnicity or social or economic status, and they can all participate and use the resources and rewards in the practical exercise of the citizens when voting or being elected. Due to historical and structural reasons, groups that are underrepresented in politics, such as young people, indigenous communities, African the communities of African descent, they all face obstacles for political participation, and this often translates in low turnout levels. And this also is manifested in low levels of representation in public office. The youth has been highlighted now as an important demographic, but we often don't see them or don't take them seriously with full rights and enough capacity and capability to be taken into account in an egalitarian way. And even though 55% of the world population are below 30 years of age, they only represent 2% of parliaments worldwide. In 73% of countries, the law limits the participation of young people, young men and women, based on their age, even though they have reached their voting age. So these situations challenge the representativity of the political system and are evidence that we need to reflect on the ways to go into the political sphere, the political environment, and the rights of these young men and women. Another very important topic is the indigenous communities that often face challenges to exercise their political rights. In Latin America, this represents about 45 million people. Before the historical inequality when it comes to wealth distribution and land concentrations, these populations were weakened, isolated, and in poverty conditions. This isolation also has political consequences. Some special challenges for these populations are having identity documents, which is an eligibility criteria to be enrolled in the voting list, and it has been one of the most important hindrances for participation. The participation of populations of African descent is still low, even though the figures are usually not that precise, and this is also something that we need to do. We estimate that 30% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean is of African descent, and in Ibero-America, Colombia has a quota of 2 members that must be of African descent in their parliament. But with the exception of Peru, the rest of the countries don't represent the ethnical composition of the country, and even though women represent 56% of the population in Latin America and the Caribbean, they are also underrepresented when it comes to politics. The notion of gender equality and political participation is based on the process in which men and women both have the same opportunities to vote or to hold office or to be members in government structures. In other words, gender equality has to do with justice in the treatment of women and men and taking into account their specific needs. The underrepresentation when it comes to politics also includes some other groups that are affected by historical hindrances and structural hindrances, and also by inequalities in access conditions for an effective participation. Some of these are the elderly, the disabled, the people who live in rural areas, and also displaced people, migrants or refugees, as well as the members of LGBTQ community. They all face material and social and cultural hindrances when they want to vote or hold public office. These obstacles include but are not limited to the scarcity of financial resources, and discrimination. And even though the participation of all these groups is very important in order to guarantee a democratic society based on justice and equity, we consider that it is specifically urgent to address the issue of women who are exposed to a specific kind of threat, which is gender-based violence in the political and electoral context in Ibero-America. So there are some actions that have been taken by some electoral bodies. Some of them have actions that are made to address this issue, but there's a lot of things that we have to do. And out of these challenges, the most urgent challenge is gender-based violence. And I think that was it for my 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Congratulations to the 3 lecturers. The 3 are excellent, but they're from different perspectives. I was going to pose some questions, but due to time constraints, I would like to go directly to the dialogue. I'm sure that you all have questions or comments. Otherwise, I will make mine, but I will give you a priority. Is there anyone that have any questions or comments? Do you see the duck? It's measuring the 7 minutes. Technology works here. Okay.
Hola.
Hello.
Buenos días, soy Dunia
Good
Sandoval
morning, I'm Nuria Sandoval from the Electoral Tribunal of
Una
Bolivia.
pregunta
I have
para
a
el tema de
question
tecnología,
for
porque en el otro panel de
technologies
género tal vez podamos
because
hacer otras.
I have other questions, but maybe
¿Qué
I can address them
regulación
in other
se ha
panels.
podido hacer en
What
España o
is
otros
the
países que
regulation that
conoces,
you have been able to do
Rafael,
in Spanish in the
respecto
Latin
a
American countries
las campañas
regarding the
políticas en redes
political
sociales?
campaigns in social media?
Eso daría para otros 7 minutos, pero
No, I will have an answer for another 7 minutes. We have two different models. The one that tries to apply what exists already for the new technologies, which is the Spaniard model. That has to do directly with adding almost automatically where it says media, electoral support, and electronic media, etc. In the case of Spain, we speak a little bit about the Bluetooth technology, but it expressly addresses it. This is a model where we understand that this is only a communication media and tries to set the regulation of the applicable things for the rest of the parties, the candidates, and the formats. In my opinion, this changes radically the scenario, because I say that if I had to compare technology or internet, I would compare it more than with the cell phone than with the television, because first of all they said that this was a television for young people, but this is not true. This is completely different. That's why it has a huge potential from the organization standpoint, etc. I mean, this is a model that is trying to apply what is already existing, and it's giving answers before specific problems, like, for example, time, space. In Spain, we have an example which is very amusing, which is the fruit market. It is forbidden to publish electoral surveys during the last week. And in a newspaper in Andorra, in Catalonia, they have an edition in Spanish. They start publishing on Monday the prices of the fruit. So the popular party is blue, so they have, like, for example, the blueberry, or not the fruit. But I mean, every day they publish and they comment very naturally the price of the fruit. So the fruit is 21, and that's the percentage of votes that the polls are giving for that day. So we have, for example, grapes at 18 and strawberry at 16, and every day the prices changes, and this is very natural. So they really, this is ridiculous, because they are taking advantage, and they are publishing what's the price of the strawberry, and that was the political party, you know. So when we try to have these traditional measures, we are not answering to all these questions. There is another smaller model of specific answers. According to my opinion, Brazil has intended it, which has a specific regulation. Like 8 years ago, they have started with this. France tried it 7 years ago, and I think that I have to stop talking because my time is out. But basically, these are two models, and specifically, very few from Brazil and France. These are the models. Thank you very much. Daniel Delgado from the Electoral Commission. So I would like to act in defense of what you have said, a legitimate defense system, because the thing is that when an electoral body has to do as the legislator, so we have, for example, and I lived these because I tried to address this topic and to go beyond what was obvious, that was to say that all the legal hindrances apply to IT. Moreover, to try that an electoral body legislate on the microfinancing through internet, for example, I mean, this demands a new legal framework. And I have said this several times, same as with the surveys and the electoral board, etc., etc. I think that this is impacting the whole electoral process. I mean, new technologies is the fundamental framework where we are working with the political forces, and they demand a whole modification of the legislation. Is this about the social media, or this is another topic, another one? Okay, I would like to briefly mention Mexico's case. Mexico has 15 years approximately by carrying out a political communication scheme in the last in radio and TV. So we have observed that this is not important. So now the new technologies are the ones that are working. Same that our legislator has mentioned that they have not been regulated. So it is evident that the regulation, it's not only the concept of the regulation itself, because the regulation, if it's not applicable to that legal framework, then it ends being a bad joke. So the tribunal and the authorities that construe the constitutional principles in electoral matters or subject matters, we have taken into consideration that such activity in internet, when it is about impacting the principles that have to do with electoral subject matter, cannot be outside the law because they are not regulated yet. And obviously, this is a very fine line dividing on how to apply those principles for specific cases, because as legal bodies, we have to be concerned also for enforcing our decisions. So, for example, in activities of the internet which are impacting a candidate that are maybe given in an island of the Pacific, or where we have not don't have the power of enforcing that authority action. So we have to be very sensitive on no ruling a hollow rulings specifically, because this is something that we are all facing, because these are global phenomena that have to drive us to make people rationalize, I mean, specifically the political stakeholders, to have some principles and conduct standards. I am going to give you some figures here about the impact in the networks, I mean the social media. These are recent data of the Latino Barometer. Look at those social media. WhatsApp, Facebook, very advanced, more than the Twitter and others. So you can see here how the social media use increased. If you see the countries that are more advanced regarding the usage of social media are Argentina, only 18% does not use, Costa Rica 20% is not using, Chile 29% not using, and Uruguay 20% are not using this social media. So almost 80% in these four countries are completely in the social media. And if we divide it or split it by the age, as Lourdes was mentioning, this is a higher percentage. But this is something that is very interesting for me. Look at this. They are measuring from 1996 to 2017. In 1996, how do they get their information of political issues? Television and radio. Up to the year 2007 or 2008, 2009, there is a fantastic book by Tom Freeman speaking about the huge impact of technology as of the year 2007, not only because Mr. Steve Jobs issued the iPhone, and now Apple is worth $900,000 billion, which is the most valuable company in the United States because of this, that has not, they have not been able to reinvent it, because as when Steve Jobs passed, they reinvented it. It's 2, 3, 4, 5, and now in version 10. So look at the impact. 28% is informed by social media. So next year, in this meeting, that 28% probably is going to go to a 40 or 50%. I just want to mention this. When we speak about that we get information by friends, family, peers, etc., we do it through WhatsApp or through the social media. So many times when you answer, for example, my friends are giving me the information, is precisely through this technological channel. So this is the disruptive topic.
Perdón, hasta hace
2 or 3 years ago, we were speaking of evolution changes where the legal frameworks can catch up. But the next are going to be completely disruptive. For example, Uber is another example. To try to regulate Uber, they are almost in all the countries with legal frameworks because of the technology. I mean, we are trying to regulate something that is on an ongoing change. If this acceleration change process, which is fantastic. For example, it's a curve that is going upwards in an increasing manner. So how are we going to follow up this? Because this impacts a lot equality, and this poses huge challenges to electoral justice, because it's not evolutionary changes, but it is a change where we have, I mean, this is a disruptive change, and we are not properly ready to understand it, but it's here to stay. This is not the thing of saying this is bad or something like that, no. The other topic, the crowdfunding, the microfinance, there is another fundamental aspect. I mean, the capability, and this was shown with the election with Mr. Obama, and now recently to be able to collect $10, $20, $30 and to do crowdfunding with the technology, microfinance. So how are we going to regulate these? So these are challenges that are very new for electoral justice, that in the future events we shall need to pay more attention to. So, I am Roman Hantings. I'm the chair of the Tribunal of the Dominican Republic. I'm very glad to be here with you today. First of all, I would like to congratulate all the panelists, and I am going to refer to what Mr. Vargas Valdez mentioned. He was mentioning the predictability of electoral justice, how electoral judges should keep a coherence regarding our decisions based on principles, and he was also referring to that in every case. But when we have to make the decision because of specificity of the case, then we are not able to understand. This is what I have called the not understood justice of decision, with some weakness that are coming from the lawyers and when they are educated in the universities, and the political leaders and the public opinion makers. I think that 50% of popularity that you mentioned that the judges have, and that they are that they have in this electoral case, it's not understood in our case in the Dominican Republic, and it could be extrapolated, is this electoral justice that is not understood. How technical aspects, like for example the preclusion principle, when it is brought to debate, the citizen, the political parties, even though they understand it, they don't take it into consideration. So this is one of the reflections that I would like, the comments that I would like to share with you in this important scenario of electoral justice bodies. Thank you very much. Regarding this misunderstanding, I have bad news for you.
Estos también son datos recientes.
These are also recent data.
Perdón que esto va tan lento, pero miren,
Look at
me
this.
faltó la L ahí en Electoral.
I'm missing an
Confianza en la
L in
institución
electoral.
electoral.
The trust in the
2017.
electoral
Ven esa
institution,
pista de
2017. Do you see that ski
Primer tramo del 51
slope?
al 40.
The first
Después
area from
bajada de
51
ahí,
to
se sube
40,
un
then
poquito,
from 40
44,
drops,
y
then
después
it
tenemos
goes
la
up
pista de
44,
esquí
and then we have
fantástica,
a huge
se
slope,
desploma del 44
which
al
drops
29.
from 44 to 29.
Sacando el caso de Uruguay, que siempre es un
Not taking into
Uruguay, digo esto con
consideration
mucho respeto, pero
Uruguay,
además con
and
mucho orgullo.
Uruguay, I respect you a lot, and I am very proud
es
of
un
you,
outlier,
because
o sea, es una cosa
Uruguay
fuera
is an
de la región,
outlier. This
en los
is
índices de economy, o sea, todos los índices que podamos revisar,
all
de
the
participación
indexes that we
electoral,
check,
etcétera,
electoral
Uruguay
participation,
realmente
etc.
es
Uruguay
país boutique,
is
casi más
really
nórdico
the
que
boutique
latinoamericano.
country,
Pero-
more
y
corresponding
Costa Rica, que
to
antes estaba muy-
the
muy
European
junto,
countries, the
había un
Nordic
dúo ahí
countries, than the Latin
Uruguay,
American
se ha ido
countries. So
desacoplando
it
y
has been
lamentablemente Costa Rica se ha ido
decoupling, and Costa Rica is more prone to be like Latin American countries than Uruguay. But as
Perú con 38,
you can
México
see,
con
Peru with 38,
Venezuela
Mexico
con 32, que debe
33,
ser,
Venezuela
me imagino, y digo esto con
32.
mucho respeto a todos los chavistas que deben creer en el Consejo Nacional
And
Electoral,
I think
que
that
no
this
nos
is
explica,
because of
y Chile
those
con
that are
31%. Y fuera de
in
eso,
the Chavez
en una situación Bolivia ahí en el
government
30,
that are in favor of
29,
this.
27.
Now you can see Bolivia 29,
Eh,
27,
bueno, no quiero
etc.
hablar
So,
de-
and I don't want to speak
de la situación, pero
about this
ese es
situation, but
una situación que hay que ponerle mucha
this
atención,
is
que viene
something that you have to
correlacionada
pay
con el
attention
tema
to
del
it,
voto
and it is
secreto.
related
Confianza en el
with
voto secreto.
the thing of the
64%
secret
promedio
vote,
regional.
64% the
Pero hay
regional
31%
average,
promedio
but there is
regional que cree que el gobierno
31%
o los
of
partidos pueden averiguar.
average
En
regional
México, el
averages that believe that
48%
these parties can do it. In
considera que el
Mexico,
voto es
38% they believe that
Esto lo veníamos
the
hablando antes de
secrecy
empezar el
of the
La
vote.
inversión. No hay otro
We
país
were
en
analyzing
yo diría
it.
en la región
There is
claramente
no
que ha
other
invertido
country in the region
todo
that
lo que
has
México ha
invested
invertido en
all
construcción de
the
institucionalidad, en ponerle candado tras
resources
candado,
that
etcétera.
Mexico
Y
has
pese a todo
invested
eso,
in the
como
locks
decía
and
Jorge
everything, and
Carpizo, hace muchos años continúa la feria de la desconfianza.
even though this, they continue non-trusting
Miren la confianza en las elecciones a lo
on
largo
this
del tiempo. Esta es
secrecy
la
of the
POP.
vote. Look at the
Cómo ha
poll.
ido
You
cayendo.
can see
Esto
how
es como
it has
cuando uno
been
va,
dropping. This is like
digo
when,
por
for
las
example,
apreciaciones. Esto es como cuando uno va del médico,
when we go
te manda a hacer
to the
los
doctor
análisis
and
y
he
vos venís
sends
y
you the
tenés
labs,
colesterol de
and you
350
come
y
and you
querés
have a
comenzar a
cholesterol of
cuestionar de que el
350,
laboratorio
and
a lo
you
mejor hizo
want
mal
to
los
question
análisis
that
porque
the
vos no
lab
podés
did
tener
not do the
350.
right job,
Tenés
etc.,
350.
because you can have
¿Me
350.
explico? O sea, no es
But
que
it
a
is
lo
what
mejor
it is.
son
You have
injustos, es lo que decía
350,
el
but
magistrado
maybe
consular.
it's not
Esto
unfair.
es un
That's
tema
what
de
you were
percepción de la
mentioning. This
ciudadanía.
is
Después,
something
si es
about
realista,
perception
no
of
es
the
realista,
citizenship.
si los hechos
Then
se condicen
we
con la
shall see
percepción,
if
pero
it's realistic or
lamentablemente
not.
ni
But
la POP, que es una encuesta
unfortunately,
seriosísima, ni Latinobarómetro
not
tienen ningún interés en
the
mentir.
POP and any
Y además
other
se van
surveys
correlacionando porque hay
had
mucha
want
relación
to lie,
de este
and
tema,
they
¿no?
are
La pérdida de la
correlated
confianza en
because, for
elecciones,
example, you
el
can
bajo
see
nivel de
here the
secreto
low
en el voto,
level of
la
the
pérdida de la
secrecy in the
confianza en las
vote, the
instituciones
lack of
electorales
trust
y
in
la
the
confianza en las elecciones.
elections, and trust in elections
Esto es, de nuevo,
specifically.
desagregado
This is
por
once
países, México
again
26%.
split by countries, Mexico, Argentina,
Colombia.
etc., etc.,
Entonces,
Colombia,
sí
Brazil,
tenemos
etc.
acá,
So we
y
do
esta es la
have,
percepción de
and
integridad
this is
electoral,
the
que es
perception of
otro
electoral
trabajo
integrity, which is a different
hecho por la
topic,
Universidad de
and
Harvard,
this is
la
a
Universidad de Sydney,
different survey
dirigido por Pippa
done
Norris,
by Harvard,
miembro de nuestro board,
Pippen
donde
Norris,
ustedes ven
who
de
is
nuevo
member of
Costa
our
Rica
board. You
en
can see
percepción de
once again
integridad,
Costa
el
Rica
concepto
in
más
integrity
amplio, que
perception,
tiene
the
el avance de la
widest
presidenta,
concept
citando Dieter Nolen,
that
de
you
verlo a
were
lo largo de todo el
mentioning
ciclo electoral, Costa Rica y
previously
Uruguay
along the whole
por encima,
electoral cycle, Costa
después vienen
Rica
algunos otros
and
un
Uruguay.
poquito
Then
mejor
we have
y
another ones
hacia
that are a little bit
Colombia
better,
para abajo,
and then we have
ya en una
Colombia
situación
and downward
bastante preocupante
in
y
a
luego
very
ya casi
concerning
siempre los últimos
situation,
lugares,
and almost
Guatemala,
always the
Honduras,
last
Venezuela.
places,
Entonces
Guatemala,
sí tenemos
Honduras, Venezuela.
un problema
So we
en
are
el cual
experiencing
la
an
justicia
issue
electoral
where
tiene que
electoral
cumplir y
justice
tiene que seguir cumpliendo un
has
papel
to
fundamental,
comply
pero también
and
está
to
afectada por una dosis de falta
fulfill
de
an
confianza en la propia democracia.
important role.
Incomprendido o no, pero está ahí.
We don't know if we are misunderstood or not, but it is there.
Además de los datos, digamos,
Besides the
contundentes
data
que
that
señala
the hard data that we have here,
Daniel, a mí me
that
parece
Daniel
que
mentioned, it
viendo
seems to me
la
And addressing Roman's concern, there is an issue that we also have to understand. Who is the client towards we are directing electoral justice? If it is any if it is any client and they are expecting justice, then they are waiting for our actions, and we have to act as arbitrators. But if that expectation, that's my concern, my concern, if we observe this chart from the year 2000 or before, up to date, how in the Mexican case, all the institutions have been strengthening through the creation of more tribunals, more voting control apparatus, etc. And there is this perception still. The hypothesis or part of the question that I have in my mind is if one has a correlation with the judicialization or legalization of the democracy. And I am saying this because when it seems to me that this factor is permanently in the environment. So the clients or those that are participating in the electoral justice does not accept the results, and they go before the tribunals because they know that this is a new way to win the elections. I mean, if I didn't win it in the polls, I'm going to win it in the tribunals. So it's difficult to win this under the perception that somebody accepted the result, and then they accepted that the triumph was not for them because they were waiting for a fair trial. Patricio, please. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. All this forum is very interesting, but I would like to mention something about my country. Specifically speaking about Daniel's case of the trust and 31%, but I think that in our case, please don't confound the administrative part and the electoral service with the electoral justice. Unfortunately, in the government of Mr. Piñera, they politicized the electoral service. Previously, during almost 90 years, there were 2 directors of electoral service. We have no issues with them. And now they splitted these positions politically. So this has gave rise to some controversies, and they have had certain attitudes that have not been the proper attitudes. But I would like to set this very clear, because electoral justice in our countries is completely different. That we, as a qualified tribunal for elections, if you ask the people, if you know us, they say, no, I don't know, we don't know them. Why? Because when we act, we are interpreting the feeling of the citizenship. And our rulings, I mean, we don't address press conferences or release press conferences or whatever. We only provide rulings. And afterwards, when I am in the position that I am going to be regarding the democracy of an electoral justice, I am going to explain a little bit more about this. But I would like to set very clear that these are 2 completely different institutions. And unfortunately, according to my opinion, we have given a step backwards. Thank you very much. I wanted to add a comment to what you have said about the technological revolution and the impact that we have had. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation. I'm not being courteous enough, mainly for a country like Mexico, and for this tribunal. Thank you very much for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity of participating in this conference. The thing with the legal standards for the regulation of new technologies and communications sets forth a series of challenges.
Y yo creo que es
It goes
necesario legislar.
outlines a series of challenges, and it's
acompañando
also necessary to legalize this,
La dificultad es lo que planteaba Kelsen hace muchos años con
What
la debida
Kelsen was
atención de la norma con la
mentioning
realidad.
long ago is
No se
the
puede
difference between the
establecer una
standards and the
norma,
reality. We cannot set
prohibición
a standard or
Ni se
a
puede,
prohibition,
por ejemplo, una norma que
and we
dijera, para hablar en
cannot
términos gruesos,
set
que no se debe
a
respirar.
standard, for
Es imposible,
example, to say
imposible
that you
cumplimiento, u
cannot
otra que
breathe
obligar en sentido
because
contrario a
it's
respirar.
not possible
Tan
to
inútil
comply
una como
with
la otra.
it, so they are useful.
Entonces, el desafío
So,
de la
The
legislación, de la
challenge of
comunicación,
the legislation of
nuevos
communication in the new
es un tema
media
que debe, no
is
sé,
something
en otros
that
organismos electorales, pero la
maybe
Corte
in other
Electoral no
electoral
tiene en Uruguay
institutions,
iniciativa
but in
en materia
Uruguay we don't
legislativa.
have initiative
Me
in
imagino que en
this
la mayoría de los
legislative
países no la
subject
tienen.
matter, and I think
Lo
that
que
most
tenemos
of
que
the countries
hacer
do not
es
have it. So what
que
we
las
have to do
legislaturas de nuestros
is
países,
that
el Poder Ejecutivo, que
the
sí lo tiene,
legislature of our
reflexionen sobre
countries
cómo
reflect
regular
on
estas
how
nuevas
to
realidades.
regulate these
Porque es
new
evidente
realities,
que
because
si
it is
caen
obvious
en un delito,
that if
aun cuando fuera un
they
delito electoral, en el
commit
momento de la
a
elección,
crime,
el
even
efecto de
though
ese
this
delito
is
ya
an
se produjo.
electoral crime,
Y
the
después
crime
revisar
was
una
already
elección en función
produced.
de esto es muy
So
difícil.
if
Y si no
you
está
have to make an
establecido el delito
election
electoral
in relation
vinculado
to
con
this,
esto,
it's going to be
tampoco puede
very
hacerse nada.
difficult. So we
De
you
manera
cannot do
que sí
anything.
existen en
So
nuestros códigos
yes,
penales, en
there
la
are
mayoría de
in
ellos,
our
delitos
criminal
parecidos, que
codes
son la difamación, la
some
injuria,
crimes
en una
like, for
pero
example,
eso
defamation.
podrá juzgarse ex post facto.
But
Por lo tanto,
we
la
can
eficacia
judge it
para
ex
asegurar el
post
resultado de las
facto.
elecciones
So
es nulo.
it's null to do it in the elections. What you have said about defamation is one of the elements that shows that this is part of the prehistoric era. So the thing here is the truth that we are going to have in the future. In the United States, the last campaign,
Más noticias falsas que
we
noticias
have
verdaderas.
had false
Y es que
news
ya no hay
and true news. So maybe
capacidad de distinguir qué
we
es
don't
falso y qué es
have the
verdadero.
capability to
No
know
importa
which
además,
is truth and which
lamentablemente,
is
qué es falso y
false.
qué es verdadero.
So
Eso es lo más grave.
this is the worst
Cuando
thing.
Trump decía que
When
Obama
Trump was mentioning or
no
saying
es
that Obama
norteamericano y que
is not an North American,
para un sector muy importante
for
de
a very important
estadounidenses
sector of the
que
United
votaron a
States
Trump,
citizens
Obama
that
sigue
voted
siendo
for
no
Trump,
norteamericano,
Obama
independientemente que
continues to be
muestre su
non-North-American, even though he has a birth
Y de eso,
certificate, a
cuando
legitimate
le
birth
decía a
certificate.
Hillary, ustedes han
And
sido
when he was
responsables
saying,
porque ustedes
Hillary, you
crearon
were
a ISIS.
responsible because you created
Entonces,
ISIS.
independientemente de
So
lo que
regardless
se diga,
of
los
what
hechos ya han
is said,
desaparecido
the
y lo
facts
que hay,
have
además de
disappeared.
las percepciones,
And
es
besides
este fenómeno brutal
perceptions,
de
we
posverdad,
have this
muy incentivado
huge
por redes,
phenomenon of the
porque además las redes tienen
post-truth,
una particularidad,
incentivated
entre
by the
otras cosas
networks,
Las redes te llevan
because
a
the
unirte a los grupos
networks
que piensan
make
como
you
vos.
unite to the
Con lo cual
groups that think
reafirma
like
el
you, have the
concepto de
same
tribu,
ideas.
va
So
rompiendo,
we
rompe
affirm
el tema
this
de
concept of
tolerancia,
the tribe.
consolida el mensaje
So
entre
it
los miembros
consolidates
de
the
esa
message
tribu.
between the
Y
members
cuando
of
vos
the
no te gusta a
tribe.
alguien,
And
además de la
if
capacidad
you
de
don't
generar
like
mayor odio,
someone,
mayor
even
discriminación,
though the
lo
capability of
eliminás.
creating more
Tan
hatred
sencillo como eso,
and
o lo bloqueás,
discrimination,
o
you
ya
block them,
no
and
lo
that's
tenés más, le
it.
haces un
And you
clic.
don't have it. You click it,
Entonces,
and
ahí
that's it.
estamos entrando,
So
en mi
this
opinión,
is where,
yo
in
creo
my
que
opinion,
la virtud del artículo de
I think that the
Economist,
virtue
más allá de
of
sus
the
exageraciones,
article of The
es realmente
Economist,
pegar un
besides its
campanazo,
exaggerations,
porque esto llegó para
is
quedarse y esto
to
está ya
hit a
cambiando
blow, because this is
realmente la manera que
changing
hacemos.
really the
Y esto
way
impacta de
we
lleno al
make
tema,
policy,
entre otras cosas,
and
al
this
tema de la equidad,
impacts
pero
mainly
fundamentalmente al
the
tema de qué es
equity,
verdad,
but
cómo yo voy
also
ahora a hacer un
the thing
juicio
that what
de lo
is
que está
truth, how am I
diciendo,
going to
etcétera, etcétera, es
judge what
prácticamente
you are
imposible.
saying? It's almost impossible to know if this
Ese
is
me
the
parece que es
truth.
un aspecto. Por
So I
favor.
think that this is one of the most important aspects.
Buenos
Please.
días, muchas gracias.
Good morning,
por la
thank you
invitación.
very
Juan
much
Carlos
for the
Silva, de
invitation, Juan Carlos Silva,
Electoral, por juicio de la Federación.
from
Me
the
parece
Electoral
que,
Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary.
tenemos que ser,
It seems to me
los
that
administradores y
we
los
have
jueces
to
y los
be
jueces
like the
más
managers, the
eficazes
administrators, and the
la
judges
manera
that
en que
have a
estamos
self-criticism.
comunicando o estamos
The way that
atendiendo
we
el
are
contexto que
communicated
estamos
or
enfrentando.
addressing
Cómo
the
estamos
context that
comunicando
we
nuestras
are facing.
estrategias, y
How
si es una
are we
cuestión nada más
communicating our
estática,
rulings,
el
and if this is
paradigma
all
que a
a
lo mejor ya se
static
tiene que superar,
thing,
que
and
se
this
habla a
is a
través de las
paradigm that we
sentencias.
have to overcome, that
Lo
we
importante
speak through our rulings. The important thing to me is that we go hand in hand with the political stakeholders. I'm very clear that many of these political parties, political stakeholders are going more for winning through the media trials. So if we are acting properly in order to be able to make our decisions social, and the way we are communicating them and conveying them is the right one, the proper one, or if we have to change and overcome this. I think that this matter of independence and impartiality has to do with something that we have to be it, but we have to seem that we are that. It's not only the decisions that we are making which are static, but the way that we are making them social. This also has to do with the culture, the acceptance of the results, for example, and also, and thus, the acceptance of the political parties and the way that we share all this with our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any additional comments? Yes, go ahead.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Hablarei em portunhol,
Good morning. I will speak in kind of Spanish, kind of Portuguese. So I hope you understand. First of all, I would like to thank you all for all the authorities that are hosting the event, for inviting us from Brazil. And I would like to give you historical news, especially for Dr. Rubio and Dr. Manuel. The last day, October 6th, 2017, the Brazilian law was amended to include a very interesting hypothesis that the High Electoral Tribunal that in Brazil adds 4 jurisdictional competences: administrative, consultative, and regulation-based, will regulate based on an internet law, and it will do so based on the existing technological tools at each election, and it will promote for the political parties and other stakeholders to convey the rules and good practices for electoral campaigns online. I don't know if it will be successful, the implementation, but it is a very interesting trend, and I just wanted to mention it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tarcisio. I would like to ask each one of the speakers that in the same order that you started, you would just make some closing comments, 3 minutes each. Well, basically, I'd like to apologize if I was misunderstood, because I understand that the main problem is a legislative problem that doesn't affect the tribunals, but in one way or another, today we are getting many cases in the tribunals that have to do with this, and I know we have our hands tied because we don't have tools to give them a right answer, but the ones we answer, sometimes we give contradicting answers because there's no real knowledge of the technologies or how the technologies are used for the campaigns. This is why my proposal was along those lines, that I think that the tribunals, even beyond the legislative branch, that the legislature, that of course the tribunal doesn't have that big of a capacity for that, but I think it is very important to have a good knowledge of that medium, have answers that adhere to reality. And I was talking about Mexican tribunal in 2012, I think, that specified that in the case of the candidate in YouTube, there was the candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador was involved in one of those cases in YouTube, and we need to understand the capability of these media and the internet to sway the voters. And I think there's something else. The problem of the post-truth is not only to do with the contents, but also the capacity to spread out these news. It's not that in the US they had more fake news than real news, but the real problem is that fake news have been shared 3 times as much as the real news. And what do you do? Because they are private citizens that share this. So that terrorizes me really, because the first answer is, okay, let Facebook tells us what's true and what's not. But some people will say that something is true and some things will say it is not. I don't think that the government should tell us what is true and what is not true either. So I think that the answer is really, really complex, but we need to address it. Otherwise, we won't be able to provide answers based on principles and not just on improvisations. And I think that's what we're seeing now in the investigation in the US. I think that's what we're seeing, just improvisation after improvisation. And I know it's a criminal investigation and not just an electoral investigation, but it has to do with it. Jose Luis, can you also mention the freedom of expression, because we haven't mentioned it and it's very important. How can we control and guarantee equity without affecting that exercise of that right? Yes, thank you, Daniel. I think that we are facing one of the main dilemmas that historically justice has faced, and someone has to say the last word. And I think that it is part of this very complex discussion of the power of the judges that Alexander Vick already talked about a few years ago. But we have to be very clear that when there are cases that are unforeseen by the legislator, and based on constitutional decrees, we have to act. Well, we have to do it based on that guide, which is the Constitution, and we have to interpret it in order to, regardless if the case has been foreseen or not by the legislator. And I think that will always be the greatest dilemma of justice. If the judge is acted outside its limitations or acted just let's say the proper and the correct measure. And what Daniel just mentioned, it can take us to 3 days of discussion, which is a freedom of expression. We can stay here for 3 days talking about it. But I do believe that it is something that, we really need to understand that we as judges are constantly pondering rights that are opposing rights. And this thing that has to do with regulating the use of the social media, the value that is, let's say, opposing it, and it's not a smaller right, and it's based not only in the Constitution but in different regulations, is the freedom of expression. And in these places where we are talking about the people or the media conveying what they think is part of the democratic life, which is public debate, well, we believe, and until now, this has been one of the main goals of our court, which is enforcing this freedom of speech and freedom of expression, because some of these stakeholders, such as public servants, have different restrictions compared to the rest of the citizens. So we have to take that into account. Lourdes, please go ahead.
Gracias. Se apaga, ciertamente.
Yes, I turned it on and then it turns itself off again. But anyways, based on the challenges that we have analyzed, this 9th Ibero-American conference can be the starting point to identify measures and to propose lines to define goals that allow us to move forward as a group in order to build more fair elections. It is important that electoral justice bodies can make sure or can guarantee that the citizens can exercise their rights, their political rights, and justice must prevail. This is why we are all here. An electoral justice system that responds to the different changes will guarantee and will help these fair elections. And I would like to make you a concrete proposal. I would like you to consider that at the end of this 9th conference, we consider 3 points. Number 1, to include a specific statement in the final resolution regarding the commitment of moving forward in equity when it comes to elections, taking into account the hardships of different minorities, disabled people, women, people from African descent, and native people in order to vote and to hold office. Number 2, to start a dialogue between the institutions that are represented here regarding the role that we can play to fight gender-based violence, specifically for action lines, and also to typify this violence, to establish mechanisms to register these violent acts, and also to serve as facilitators in order to work with the stakeholders to monitor and produce reports regarding this gender-based violence. And number 3, to create a group that is in charge of producing guidelines so we can have progress indicators for these underrepresented groups, especially the rights of women not to suffer any kind of harassment or violence just for the fact of being women. This system can be established using as a parameter the commitments undertaken by the institutions in the framework of this political harassment against women, and it can be revised in future editions of the SIGE. So I think that this has been a very interesting panel. So we will have a short break, I believe, and then we will continue with the next panel. Thank you. We will just have a 5-minute break. Thank you.